Okay, ladies, this is my makeup of photographing the night sky, your master class, and my apologies for this morning, but this is your makeup for this. And your homework that you all sent in, where you were supposed to photograph the full moon, and you were also supposed to do some light painting. And some of you did send in some full moon photographs. And I am going to click these really, really quickly because I want to go through them again next week when we're all together. So Carol, here's your shot. Here's your beautiful shot of the moon once it gets above the haze. And then here you did a fabulous job on this one. And then Carol, here's your makeup sunset sunrise picture. And this one also, which we'll talk about in more detail next time around. And then this one, which I just absolutely love. I think you did a great job on this shot. And then Stephanie, here is yours. You can just barely see the moon poking above the horizon right there, or the haze on the horizon, when we'll talk about this in more detail next week. And then here's your moon once it gets a little higher up in the sky. And then here is your full moon and 600 millimeters. And once again, we'll talk about this a bit more next week when I see you all together. So class 3 on your handout, here's what we're going to cover this go around. One thing I'd like you to understand about photographing the moon, the full moon, is that we do have to do some noise reduction to it. And so here's a before and after with the noise reduction. So be sure that when you are photographing the full moon that you go ahead and do a little bit of noise reduction on it. You also might want to sharpen it just a little bit to kind of bring out some of the details in some of the craters on the moon. And white balance is also really important with your night photography. Here's a shot of a little church out in the desert with already processed and with the white balance corrected. And then this is what it looked like coming straight out of the camera. So I want you to understand that a lot of our night sky photography, we do have to do processing. And so don't feel bad if you feel like you're doing a bit more processing than you might do normally with your photography, because night sky stuff, we just have to do that. But here's another example of what happens with white balance. And this is, for instance, in Spain. We get this beautiful golden glow from the buildings in Spain. But if I touch one of these lights down in this area right here where my cursor is, with the white balance tool in either Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, then I can correct that golden glow to more realistically what I saw with my eye. So there are some people that are going to like this golden glow, and there are some people that are going to like things in this respect. So just understand that we can change that white balance later on. Don't change it in the field. We can also change it later on. And with our night sky photography, like our Milky Way, we do have to change the white balance later on. Once again, I don't change it in the field, and I don't change it in the field because I'm going to forget to change it back. And that's why I don't change it in the field. I just leave my white balance on auto white balance, and then I don't have to worry about changing it back during the daylight. It's one of those things you'll forget if you're not careful. So a photo like this of the Milky Way is going to appear a little on the milky side, not meaning Milky Way, but a little bit more milky. And we're going to have to just go in with our white balance slider in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, move it a little bit more toward the blue side, and then it turns out looking exactly like we want it. So we're going to talk today about pinpoint stars. And by pinpoint stars, we mean stars that when we blow that picture up, there is no smudge at all in that star, not toward the edge of the pictures, not in the middle of the pictures. None of the stars have any smudges. And the smudging is coming because of the Earth moving. So what we mean by seeing, creating a photo with good pinpoint stars is that when we blow that picture up, to 100%, we don't see any of those stars that have started to smudge because of the Earth's movement. So it takes looking at the picture at 100%. I double check it in the field when I'm out there. I blow it up to 100% and then scan along the edge of the photograph to make sure none of the stars are getting any sort of distortion in them. A photo like this, you look at it, and if you look really closely, you can immediately tell that the stars have streaked. This is Neowise, the comet a couple of years ago. And unfortunately, my brain didn't kick in because I get to this location. It's during the COVID lockdown, so I'm not supposed to be traveling. I get to the location that I'm going to and find, get everything all set up, and then I can start to see Neowise, but these clouds are moving in really fast. And so I just start photographing, and brain doesn't kick in that I've got to take into account what lens I'm using, because what lens I'm using determines what shutter speed I use. So on your handout, I have given you the formula for figuring out what shutter speed you need to photograph pinpoint stars. And you can see when I blow this picture up, here's the little smudgy stars, just simply because, and then here's the comet over here, just simply because the Earth has moved during my exposure. And as a result, I have little smudgy stars. So here is the formula that you need to take into account. So for pinpoint stars, you need to take 500 divided by the millimeters of your lens. So 500 divided by a 16 millimeter lens is going to be 31 seconds. 500 divided by an 18 millimeter lens is going to be 27 seconds. And I suspect each one of you all in this class has your 16 millimeter lens. 500 divided by a 10 millimeter is going to be 50 seconds. But also, if you have a crop factor, meaning your sensor is smaller than a piece of 35 millimeter film, you need to take into account the crop factor. And all of you all with your R5, R6, and 5D Mark IV, you all have a full sensor camera. So you don't have to do the crop factor, but just in case you're ever with anybody that has a crop factor. So you have to do, if you have a crop factor sensor, Canon Rebel, 7D, Mark II, any of the Olympus cameras, you have to do 500 divided by parentheses, the millimeters of the lens times the crop factor. And remember back to mathematics when you were in 7th and 8th grade, we had to do what was in the parentheses first. So you do what's in the parentheses first, and then you take that number, 500 divided by that number, and that gives you 17-second exposure for somebody using an 18 millimeter lens on a Canon Rebel. So you all, I suspect, have 16 millimeter lenses or 15 millimeter lenses. So you're going to be about 31 seconds, but you also need to test that. So you need to put that lens on your camera. You need to go out under the night sky, and you need to take an exposure, say, for 31 seconds. That's my 16 millimeter lens. And then if you look really closely at the edges, notice that we've got little smudgy stars toward the edges, not in the middle, but toward the edges. And so that means that even though that's the mathematical formula for that lens, that's not right. So what I have found just through trial and error is on my 16 to 35 millimeter lens, the exposure for pinpoint stars is 15 seconds, half as long as what it would have been by the formula. And my 15 millimeter lens, the new one that I have for my R cameras, it is even shorter. It's 10 seconds. So you have to do the math first, 500 divided by the millimeters of your lens. That gives you your starting shutter speed. Take a shot, see what you get. And by the way, this means that you are opening your lens up as wide as you can get it, so 2.8 or 4, and then you're raising your ISO to 800 or 1600. So those are your two other factors that you have to take into account for your night exposure. So once again, you have to open your aperture as wide open as you can get it. And then you have to go either 800 or 1600 on your ISO. So a shot like this, I did fine, everything looks good, but then you look at those edges and those edges have little smudgy stars on them. And so here in the same type of exposure, but now I'm going down into that 10 seconds or 15 seconds, depending on what lens you're using. And now we don't see any little smudges. Downside, I've got to have a higher ISO because it's a shorter exposure. So once you figure out exactly what your exposure is going to be, or what your shutter speed is going to be for pinpoint stars, then forever and ever and ever with that lens, you're going to be the exact same seconds on your exposure. Open your aperture all the way up, and whether or not you go to ISO 800 or whether you go to 1600, or maybe even your ISO goes to 100 or 200, depends on how much moonlight we have. So if we have a lot of moonlight in the sky, then we're going to have to really drop the ISO because it's so bright. If we don't have a lot of moonlight in the sky, it's a real black sky, then we're going to end up having to go to 1600 ISO, if not 800 ISO. If you happen to have a lens that goes to 1.4, then let's say, once again, you're going to be in that 15-second exposure or 10-second exposure, and then that lens would go to a 1.4, then probably your ISO is going to be 800. So after a while of using that lens, you'll get a feel for, okay, I probably should do this at 800 ISO. It's really dark. I should do this at 1600 ISO. But then it becomes pretty standard. There's not much deviation from it. And so just learn what it is with that particular lens that you're going to use for the night sky. And then you don't have to worry about it too much. The only variation is going to be how much ISO you use. So for here in the Lofoten Islands doing the Aurora Borealis, I didn't want any smudges at all around the edges of the frame. This is the 16mm Canon lens, 16-35. This is my 15-second exposure. It goes to 2.8. We didn't have any night sky or moon in the night sky. We had a really, really nice dark sky. So that tells me that my ISO is about 1600. And once you get the exposure down, that's it. If the moon comes up, then we got to lower the ISO. If the moon sets, then we've got to raise the ISO. But once you get everything set, it's pretty much universal. And so that's the good thing about doing pinpoint stars, is once you learn what your settings are with that lens, the only variation that we've got in that lens is whether or not the moon's in the sky. Otherwise, everything remains pretty much about the same. And then we can just shoot, have a great time, and not have to worry about anything. So this is the 5D Mark IV, ISO 1600 on a really nice dark sky night during the Pleiades meteor shower. And this isn't one exposure. This is one exposure, and then the different meteors have been overlaid on that one exposure because, you know, they only come, supposedly we're getting hundreds an hour, but it really doesn't work that way in the meteor showers. We get one or two that we can see every so often. 5D Mark IV gives us very little noise during the night sky photographs. And so we've got a really, really nice even exposure because we don't have a lot of noise. Same thing, ISO 1600 on a Canon Rebel T6, so not even, you know, the latest Canon Rebel, and look at how much noise we've got in that sky. That sky is almost just solid noise, unfortunately. So you all are working with the R5 and R6 and 5D, so you're working with really nice cameras. So if you do raise your ISO to 1600, you should be perfectly fine. You've got to make sure that you're on a good tripod. And I use the MePhoto Globetrotter classic carbon fiber tripod. So just make sure you're on a nice sturdy tripod. Make sure that's tripod that your camera locks down on it really well. And also make sure that you know how to use your tripod in the dark. If your tripod is not easy to use, and if you don't love your tripod, then you've got the wrong tripod. So if you don't have a tripod that you just really embrace and it's easy to use, you've got the wrong gadget. So think about it to buy a MePhoto Globetrotter classic carbon fiber tripod. I have the 4 legs instead of the 3 legs, and it folds down to a little bit smaller when it has 4 legs versus when it has 3 legs. So focusing on infinity. So this is another tricky thing that people have when they're doing night sky photography. None of you all are Nikons, but just in case you're ever in the field with any Nikon photographers, Nikon lenses, we put the little line in the middle of the infinity symbol. This holds true for Tamron lenses and Sony and Sigma lenses as well. We put the little line in the middle of the infinity symbol. For Canon lenses, we put the little line on that perpendicular line, and we line those two up. And so a Canon lens like this one, the 16-35, this is how we know that it's focused on infinity, when the white line lines up with the other white line. So Tina, this is what you would use on your camera. But Carol and Stephanie, you all have the R camera and maybe the R lenses. So on an R camera or any of the mirrorless cameras, we turn the autofocus on manual. And when we do, we get this bar that shows up. And when that bar shows up, then we line up the little line on the focus ring as we move the focus ring on the lens. That's what changes the focus on the back of the camera. We line it up with the middle of the infinity symbol. And so now with the Canon R cameras, we are now lining up the line with the middle of the infinity symbol, pretty much like the rest of the photography world does. So we can see when we're focused on infinity, when we line those 2 lines up. A warning to anybody with the R lenses, the focus on them is very sensitive. And so I recommend that you also tape it down with some gaffer's tape, the front of the lens, the focus ring on the lens, because if you move your camera around on its tripod, which we do at night because we're getting different compositions, then make sure that you refocus your lens, because unlike the previous lens that I showed you, like this lens right here, once I set this lens on its focus point, it rarely changed as I moved my camera around in the dark. But the R lenses, they'll move. The focus will change on those. And so if you're going to be moving your camera in the dark and you're using an R lens, make sure that you double check every single time to make sure that you have refocused it on infinity. Now, why we want to focus on infinity is because we're photographing the sky. We're photographing the stars. And so we want the stars to be in focus. There's a tricky point that comes when we have something like the windmill that's close to us, and then we want to focus on infinity. Sometimes we have to go in and play with this a bit, and we may not focus totally on infinity. We might focus a little bit before infinity. That's that depth of field. So just watch that just a little bit. But once we get our focus set, we get our pinpoint star setting set. Remember, that's your 500 divided by the millimeters of your lens. We figure out what our ISO needs to be. We know that our f-stop is our wide open f-stop. Then from there on, it's just having fun photographing the night sky and then getting challenging and getting creative. This is a panorama of the Milky Way going from the southern sky to the northern sky out in Big Bend National Park. Now you got to realize that going from the southern sky to the northern sky in July in Big Bend National Park, the Milky Way goes overhead. It doesn't go along the horizon, it goes overhead. And so this was using a wide angle lens, turning it vertical and making sure that in each shot that I took, as a vertical, that I had some of the foreground in it so that there would be something to line up. Really difficult shot to take. Just because I had to do 15 or 20 different shots, and I had to make sure that the bottom of each frame had some of the horizon in it so that we could line it up later on, or software could line it up later on, and it worked. So not something I'm willing to do right away and do it again. And I'd even hate to demo it because it was something that I just had to really work on, but gives you the arc of the Milky Way across the night sky. In April, by the way, we will see the arc lower on the horizon from the south to the north. And so it's a little bit easier to photograph at that point, but it's also difficult because you're talking about going all the way compass directions south, all the way north. And so this is a huge amount of sky that you're trying to cover with one lens. So it does make it really difficult, but it's fun anyway. Come summertime, so a little bit more where we are going into right now, the Milky Way stands straight up in the sky or slightly angles in the sky. So once again, get to where we know exactly what our shutter speed is for the lens that we're using, we know that it's a wide open aperture. We know that our ISO is going to be either 800 or 1600, depending on how much moon we have, or in this case, how much ambient light from nearby cities we have. And then from there on, we can just photograph the Milky Way anytime we see it. Airplane here, airplane up here. And you notice even I've got a little bit of smudgy stars on the edge of it because I could have gone a little shorter exposure. So from there on, we can just start playing. We can do our pinpoint stars. We can put anything that we want to in the foreground. We can do our pinpoint stars, and we can light paint the foreground like we learned in previous lesson with the light paintings. And then once we learn how to do that Milky Way, find out where the Milky Way is, then from there on, it just becomes routine photography for us. And we can, once we get that Milky Way where we want it or figure out where that Milky Way is, then we can go ahead and photograph it because all it is really is pinpoint stars. So it makes it fairly easy once we get all of those little components down, because now we can do any pinpoint star photography that we want to do. Now, where we are right now, we are a summertime, so our Milky Way is standing fairly tall in the sky. And this is a copy of my screen for today or tonight on Stellarium. It's one of the apps for finding where constellations are in the sky and where our Milky Way is in the sky. This is for tonight. And you see, if we point our camera in the southern direction, then the Milky Way is going straight up just like this, or at a slight angle in the southern sky, going over toward the northern sky. And then here's where we've got Antares, for instance. And so I can once again see that down here on my app, my cell phone app, that I'm facing the southern sky. And then this is for 12 o'clock at night. 31. So tonight, 12:31, really tomorrow morning, 12:31 to be exact. If you face the southern sky, then your Milky Way is going to be up. The neat thing about Stellarium, and here's a vertical shot of the same thing. The neat thing about Stellarium is that I can click on this time right here, and I can go through the time or through the date. So I can go through the time and then check out what date I would like to be, or maybe my vacation is the 29th of June. So on the 29th of June, where's the Milky Way going to be? What direction do I have to face? Cheater, it's always in the southern sky. What direction do I have to face? And what time do I have to be out there when the Milky Way gets really high above the horizon? So for us, for the next month or so, we're going to be able to see the Milky Way from about an hour after sunset, going all the way through until about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And so if you're a morning person and it doesn't bother you to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, then find out what time, where the Milky Way is going to be at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm more of a night person. I'd rather stay up and then go to bed later on in the evening. So I always look for more closer to after sunset. When can I see the Milky Way? But this is Stellarium. It's a pretty simple, easy program to use. And it's really more designed for sky watchers. But I find it really simple to use for planning where I'm going to be and what time I need to be out and where the Milky Way is going to be so that I can photograph the Milky Way. So star trails. Now that you know about pinpoint stars, it's time to start working on those star trails. So I've given you in your handout about doing the Milky Way, direction of the Milky Way, and now it's time now it's time to start working on the star trails. So you need your programmable cable release. I've talked about this before, your Velo Shutter Boss wired variety. Make sure that the pin fits on your camera. And by the way, the connector, this is what goes on a R6. And the R5 and the 5D use this connector right here. So how maddening is that Canon on their 3 top cameras would use different connectors, but that's the way that they do. So make sure you buy the right Velo Shutter Boss 2 for your camera that you're going to use for night photography. There's a YouTube video on my YouTube channel to tell you how to set it up for everything that I'm telling you from now on. So when we do our star trails, we are looking for this spiral around the North Star. Milky Way, remember I told you, was in the southern sky. So the galactic cloud anyway is in the southern sky. The tail end of the Milky Way is in the northern sky, but the galactic cloud is in the southern sky. So for our star trails, we're going to point our camera toward the North Star, Polaris, and this gives us the spiral because the Earth is rotating around the North Star, around Polaris. That's why it was the navigating star that everybody used. So by simply pointing our camera at the North Star, getting our composition like we want it, and then from there on, we set the intervalometer and the Velo Shutter Boss 2, plug it in, and then using your little handout also to make sure that you're getting all your components set properly. Then we need to, looking on your handout, we need to set the camera to JPEG. If you're using an older camera, I go ahead and I use, or computer, I just go ahead and shoot in RAW because it doesn't bother my computer at all. You have to set your camera on bulb, set your camera on the widest f-stop possible. So the 2.8, 3.5, 1.4, set your ISO to your 800 or 1600, like I talked about on the previous pinpoint stars. Turn off your image stabilization or your vibration reduction, turn off your autofocus, and then also make sure that your long exposure noise reduction is turned off. That's in your red menus on all your Canon cameras. Make sure your autofocus is turned off, image stabilization is turned off, and then you're going to focus on infinity. Camera's on a nice sturdy tripod. You're going to take a test shot and then make sure that your camera takes a 4-minute exposure, clicks, starts another 4-minute exposure, turn that one off. Skip the last picture because that was just a very short picture, so its chances are it's black. Look at the picture before that, the 4-minute exposure. Check to see whether or not you really are focused on infinity. Check to see whether or not you need to raise or lower your ISO. Double check your focus to make sure that you actually are in focus on infinity. And then if everything works right, then click on your intervalometer again, make sure it goes through a 4-minute exposure, and then learn from my mistakes. Sit through the next 4-minute exposure. So you're sitting through 8 minutes out there, but make sure it clicks again, and then you can go eat dinner or go to sleep, whichever one you want. But just make sure, double check that thing's working, because otherwise you're going to come back in a couple of hours and hope that you have in really nice makings of a photograph, and you won't. So check it twice, make sure, and then leave. Yeah. So your star trails, we just gives us the ability to always point toward that North Star. This is what happens on a really, really dark night, by the way, when we have the tail end of the Milky Way in the photograph, because remember, the tail end of the Milky Way is in the North sky. And so this is pointing toward the North Star. And all of these stars that you're seeing in here is because I'm pointing toward the tail end of the Milky Way. So if we get a really, really dark sky, then you're going to end up with a lot of stars in your star trail. And that's the treasure. That's what we're going for. Plan ahead of time where you're going to be. This is looking north toward Tucson, Arizona. I had planned it ahead of time because I knew where there was a skeleton of a saguaro cactus near where we were staying. So I lined that North Star up with that saguaro cactus. So figure out where you're going to be ahead of time to take your picture. And then look also at all of the beautiful colors of the various stars around the edges of the frame. Each one of the stars has a different temperature to it, so it gives us a different color. So it's nice to see when we've got some color in those stars. If you're closer to the horizon, this is Tanzania, right on the horizon, then you won't see a North Star, or your North Star would just be barely above the horizon or below the horizon. So you're just going to get an arc of the stars if you're close to the equator. Here's another one in Tanzania, and the light lighting up the acacia trees is a simple light from my cabin. So it's just a click of the porch light and an unclick of the porch light to turn it on. You don't need, or turn it off. You don't need very much light to light up those trees when it's a solid dark sky. More toward Morocco, so we're getting more of an arc as opposed to a complete spiral. And then this is just candlelight illuminating from the walkway that was lit by candles to get to our tents. But this is up near Willis, Texas. So a little bit north of the Woodlands, Texas, not quite to Huntsville. That's Huntsville off in the distance there, the lights of Huntsville. So we can do star trails around the Houston area, just depending on where you are and how far away you can get from city lights. And then see what we can get. So this happened to be a dark sky night, no moon, during the winter. And so calculation was that there would be less porch lights and things like that lit because in neighboring farms. This is in the Texas Hill Country near Fredericksburg. And the little green things are fireflies during the summertime. And then here's another one with tons of fireflies out at the Madre de los Dios in Peru. Just tons and tons and tons of fireflies over the river. And then this is once again the tail end of the Milky Way. So we get this kind of real conglomeration of stars. And then here, I think we're south of the equator. So this is the Southern Cross right here, the tip of the Southern Cross right here for the southern sky. Here's another southern sky down in Brazil, and this is the top of the Southern Cross. That's the equivalent star in the southern hemisphere. And, so depending on what kind of lights we've got, we can try to put that star trail in front of things. I thought I was staying at a pretty dark eco lodge, but it turned out those lights were really, really bright. So once again, they should have just been turned on and turned off if we had that possibility. Some people will recommend certain lenses for doing star trails and night photography. One of my favorites was the Rokinon 14mm lens. And the beautiful thing about this Rokinon is that it is white balanced by the coatings on the lens to give you beautiful colors in the stars. So it's a favorite of night photography people, Rokinon. They don't make one for an R lens, but so you would have to use the adapter. But for me, the Canon lenses work really well. The 15 to 35 and the 16 to 35 work really well. But the Rokinon lens is a good lens. And then also there are different ways that we can play around with this. Here's one photo, and I processed this using Bridge Adobe Camera Raw and the instructions I gave you. This is processed with a software called Astro Panel 4, and it will process your star trails for you. Personally, I kind of like what I did a little bit better, but if you're intimidated by layers, or you just want to buy an app that'll do it for you, then Astro Panel 4 is not a bad one that it'll do. This is Astro Panel 4 also. And one of the things that Astro Panel will do is it will make the stars at the beginning or the end of the star trail more pronounced. So it sort of looks like the stars are like sweeping around. So it's made them just a bit more pronounced. You can make them more pronounced in the beginning or more pronounced at the end, whichever one you would like to do. But it is one of those things that Astro Panel 4 will do. Here's another night sky up in Fredericksburg that was photobombed by the fireflies. It's interesting. I looked at this and I thought, oh, they ruined my star trail. And I posted it on Facebook just saying, oh, the fireflies ruined my star trail. And everybody liked it. So I've just kept it the way it is with all the without all the firefly photo bombs. But notice once again, the beautiful colors we get in the various stars based on the temperature of them. This is looking in the northern direction, summer sky, obviously, because we have the fireflies. But we can do star trails even when we're just a little bit near the Fredericksburg area. Skies are dark enough out there. Be sure before you walk away from your camera at night that you're focused, because otherwise you spend all night out there, or your camera spends all night out there, and you've invested all that time and that effort into getting you a star trail. And if you look real carefully, it's not in focus. So make sure that you've dotted all your I's, crossed all your T's, double checked everything. Use my handout as an as a checklist to make sure that you cover all your bases. And that last thing, make sure that you focus to that camera. I remember calling back, walking all the way back to my camera, to my cabin this night, crawled in bed, got all ready to go to sleep. And then I thought, oh, did I refocus that camera? And you know what? I didn't. So make sure that you refocus your camera and make sure that it is focused before you walk away from it. So the instructions for blending your star trails are on your handout, and believe it or not, they are exactly like blending your tail lights. So it's the same layer blend using the lighten mode. So they're all the same, and it's a good knowledge of layers for you to have. So your homework for your next class is photograph a scene where you paint the foreground. Remember, we're supposed to do this on last week's homework as well, but I don't think you all got around to it. So paint the foreground with some light. Second photograph a scene where you paint the foreground with a different light. Use a flashlight one time and then use an LED panel another time. Photograph a scene with taillights or headlights. Find yourself a parking garage somewhere or a vantage point so that you can look out over a street. Even if you have to, just do this in your neighbor, your own neighborhood, and have somebody drive the car for you. Don't make it complicated if you don't have to, but if you can find a parking garage nearby, that's always my favorite vantage point, is the top of a parking garage. And then photograph a scene with fireworks if you know that there's any fireworks going on in your neighborhood. And then we're adding another assignment to that: photograph a scene with pinpoint stars. You can do this the same time from the top of the parking garage with the cars, as long as the sky is dark. Paint the foreground if you can. Little or no moonlight coming up because the moon's disappearing on us. Try your hand at a star trail if you can. Those of you that are living more in the southern part of the city, more in the Galveston area, you've got a little bit darker sky down in there. So try your hand at that with the star trail. And then the Milky Way, as I showed you already, is up there at 12:33 tonight. try your hand at a visible constellation or else the Milky Way. And then send those pictures to me. Remember to resize them, and you can just attach them to an email. If you want to put them in the Dropbox, go ahead and put them in the Dropbox. Either way, I look forward to seeing your homework assignments. Keep your fingers crossed that my internet connection doesn't fail on me next class. Otherwise, I'm going to send this recording to you, and I will see you on the night or in the morning of the 27th with all your homework pictures, because that'll be the last time that we meet. So let's get all these homework pictures in, and we'll talk about your homework and then the last few lessons in night sky photography. So thank you all for bearing with me this morning and for worrying about me. Thanks, Carol. I think you sent my husband an email making sure I was okay. Thank you very much for worrying about me. You all have a good time. I'll send this recording to you, and then I'll see you next week at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. Bye.